It began with a crash through the ice and ended with a truth that nearly brought a 69-year-old veteran to his knees. When Silas Merrow followed a trail of paw prints to a collapsing shed on the North Hallow coast, he expected to find a stray, maybe even a dangerous one. Instead, he found a starving German shepherd chained to a beam, her ribs sharp as knives, 3 newborn pups trembling beneath a shredded jacket. The scene screamed cruelty. No food, no shelter, a heavy iron chain cutting into raw skin. But one detail shattered every assumption: a cracked phone hidden under the floorboards, holding an unsent message from a young man who had spent his last strength crawling for help, not abandoning the dog he loved. As Silas uncovered each layer of this coastal tragedy, his anger crumbled, replaced by a grief he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. You are not ready for the real reason that chain was locked. Stay with us for this heartbreaking story, and please help us grow by subscribing. Under a dim slate sky above North Hallow, the late winter cold clung to everything like a second skin. Silas Merrow moved slowly across the riverbank, the same way he moved through most things in life now, deliberately, stiffly, as if every step carried the weight of 6 decades behind him. At 69, he was a tall, lean man whose military frame had thinned rather than softened with age. His shoulders, still broad though slightly stooped, hinted at the soldier he once was. Deep-set gray eyes sat beneath heavy brows, eyes that had seen far too many things: jungles burning, friends falling, helicopters thundering into the night. A beard of coarse white and silver etched the hard angles of his jaw, the same jaw people in town said had the shape of a man who had never learned how to surrender. He lived alone in a weather-worn cabin facing the half-frozen river. The only creature that shared his life was Marlowe, a one-eared tabby cat older than most of the teenagers in town. Marlowe was a tattered relic, scarred, unevenly colored, and stubborn. His remaining ear stood rigid like a crooked flag, and his yellow eyes always held a judgmental squint. He had survived coyotes, storms, and Silas's unpredictable cooking. If the cat had a personality, it was silent disappointment. Yet every night he slept on Silas's chest, purring like a small, aging engine. To Silas, that was loyalty enough. The morning had begun with a subtle unease. The sky hung low, swollen with moisture, the clouds thick as wet wool. The river was no longer locked in deep winter's grip. Its surface was a treacherous mosaic of thinning ice and black water. Silas should have stayed closer to shore. He knew that. His doctor had told him, his aching knees had told him, and Marlowe, who meowed furiously at the door, had certainly told him. But Silas had always been a man who pushed farther than he should. War had carved that into him. The impulse to just check one more thing had saved him once and nearly killed him often. Today, it might do both. He marched out to retrieve a forgotten fishing net, a minor task, barely worth the trip. But he hated leaving things undone. It reminded him too much of the missions he couldn't finish in his youth. The wind cut sharply across the ice, slicing through his wool coat, carrying with it the metallic scent of distant snowmelt. The surface beneath him groaned, shifting like something alive. He felt the tremor. It wasn't much, just a small shudder, but it sent a thin thread of fear up his spine. "Shouldn't have come out this far," he muttered. No one responded but the wind. He took another step. The world cracked. It wasn't a dramatic shatter, more like the snapping of a bone in the dark, quick, final, irreversible. The ice beneath his boots fractured in a spiderweb pattern. The center collapsed. Silas plunged downward, the river swallowing him whole. The cold was not cold, it was violence. Water knifed into his chest, stripping the breath from his lungs. His coat ballooned with icy weight. He kicked upward desperately, hands clawing for the rim of ice, but everything was slick, treacherous. His heart hammered wildly. The sound of it drowned out even the river. His mind screamed old orders, old instincts. Don't freeze, don't sink, don't stop. But another voice, darker, older, whispered, "Maybe it's finally time." Images flared in the murky water, a friend's hand slipping from his grip, the flash of gunfire in the jungle, the sickening silence after an explosion. 50 years of ghosts dragged at him like anchors. He felt consciousness thinning, drifting. Then, above the roar of the river, a sound split the air. A bark, low, commanding, unmistakably alive. He surfaced just long enough to see a blur of brown and black sprinting across the cracking ice. The dog was a German shepherd, young but malnourished, its ribs faintly visible beneath a rough coat. Its fur was matted in places, especially around one shoulder where an old scar twisted the hair pattern. But its eyes, deep amber, bright with focus, burned with startling intelligence. It skidded to the edge of the break and, without hesitation, lunged forward. Not foolishly. It kept its hind legs braced on solid ice while stretching its body long. Its teeth clamped onto the collar of Silas's coat. The first pull barely shifted him. The second brought his chest closer to the edge. The third tore a sound from his throat that was half pain, half hope. He kicked, clawed, coughed, and somehow, through the combined effort of a drowning old soldier and a starving stray, Silas's arms found purchase. He hauled himself forward, scraping elbows and knees on the ice, until he rolled fully onto solid ground. He lay there shuddering, chest burning, breath shattering in his lungs. The world spun in muted colors. For a long moment he didn't move, afraid the ice might betray him again. The dog did not leave. It stood guard beside him, trembling in the wind. Its breath came out in short, white puffs. Its ears flicked back nervously whenever the ice creaked, but it didn't take a single step away from Silas. The old man's voice came out rough and broken. "You're not leaving me, soldier?" The dog tilted its head. There was no fear in its eyes, only a steady, almost questioning warmth. It took a few steps forward, stopped, and looked back as if urging him onward. Silas forced himself up. Every joint screamed. The cold clung to him like iron, but he followed. Step by agonizing step, the dog led him toward the vague outline of his cabin through the swirling mist. Marlowe watched from the porch, tail flicking with offended disbelief as Silas stumbled up the steps. Before Silas could say more than a rasped, "Thank you," the shepherd looked at him one last time, an unreadable look, something between concern and farewell, then turned and disappeared into the drifting curtain of wind. Silas stood there, dripping, shaking, alive, saved by a stranger whose name he didn't know, and the only thought echoing through his mind was, "I owe that dog a debt I may never repay." Morning in North Hallow rose dull and gray, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones without needing a storm to carry it. Silas Merrow woke with the heaviness of someone who had already died once in his dreams, and then remembered he was, inexplicably, still here. His tall, lean frame ached in a dozen familiar places and 3 new ones. His shoulders, still broad but slightly bent from years of hauling more than his share, protested when he pushed himself upright. His lungs burned faintly, a reminder of the river's claws around his chest. As he swung his legs over the side of the narrow bed, the floorboards creaked and the sound set Marlowe off. The one-eared tabby sprang from the chair, his mottled fur bristling, and launched into a rasping lecture of meows that sounded, to Silas, suspiciously like, "What were you thinking yesterday?" Yeah, I know," Silas muttered, rubbing the heel of his hand against his temple. His beard, wiry and white, scratched his palm. In the bathroom mirror, he caught his reflection, deep-set gray eyes ringed with fatigue, a face carved with lines of old anger and older grief. He looked like a man who had been pulled out of the river and left on the bank to dry in the wind, which, he supposed, wasn't far from the truth. He had spent most of last night under hot water until his skin flushed red, then wrapped in wool blankets beside the stove, listening to Marlowe's grudging purr against his ribs. He had swallowed the pain pills the doctor in town insisted he keep for bad days, and tried not to think about the feeling of the ice giving way beneath him. But trying not to think about something only made the mind circle back harder. He kept seeing the same image. Amber eyes locked on his, a black and tan head leaning forward over the broken lip of the ice, teeth gripping his collar with determined ferocity. The unknown German shepherd had appeared out of nowhere, acted with purpose, and vanished into the fog. Silas was not a man who liked mysteries. He especially did not like being in debt. By the time he finished his coffee, black, bitter, slightly burned, his decision had settled into him like a stone. He shrugged into his heavy coat, the same one still faintly stiff from having been soaked the day before, and took his wooden cane from its resting place by the door. His knees argued as he straightened to his full height, but he ignored them. Marlowe hopped onto the windowsill, making a disgruntled trill in his throat, as if to say, "This is a bad idea." And Silas paused long enough to scratch the cat between his eyes. "Just going to look," he lied softly. "I owe that dog a thank you, that's all." Outside, the world was a palette of wet whites and tired grays. The storm hadn't returned, but the air held a chill that slid under clothing like whispered disapproval. The river no longer raged. Instead, it sulked in black channels between thinning slabs of ice. Along the bank, a thin crust of slushy snow lay over the earth, soft enough to accept impressions, firm enough to keep them. Silas's boots sank in with a muffled squelch as he approached the spot where he'd broken through yesterday. The ice around the hole had frozen into ugly ridges, a scar in the river's skin. He stared at it for a moment, feeling a phantom grip close around his ribs. Then he forced his gaze lower. There they were. Tracks. The prints were unmistakable, deep oval paw marks, with claw tips etched clearly at the front, spaced in a purposeful line leading away from the riverbank. They were larger than a farm dog's, more compact than a wolf's, and set with a certain neatness that spoke of control even in desperation. Intermixed with them, at irregular intervals, were his own chaotic footprints from yesterday, dragging, stumbling, half erased by the night wind. But the dog's trail was fresh enough, pressed into the damp snow and angling away from the cabin toward the coast. "Smart, aren't you?" Silas murmured, his breath drifting in a fine white gust. "Knew where you were going, more than I can say for myself most days." He followed, step by step, cane digging into the crust. He tracked the line of paws as they cut across low shrubs and wind-polished rocks, heading toward the faint taste of salt on the air. The farther he went, the more his body reminded him he was not the 20-year-old who used to run patrols in jungle heat. His knees throbbed, his lower back turned to iron, and every inhale pricked at the lingering soreness in his lungs. But another feeling grew alongside the pain, a coil of curiosity wrapped around a hard knot of responsibility. He had seen that look before, the look in the dog's eyes when it leaned toward him on the ice. It was the same expression men wore when they decided they would not leave someone behind, even if they had to crawl. Whoever had raised a dog like that had not done so by accident. Whoever had left it on its own. The prince led him to the edge of North Hallow's abandoned pier. Once, years ago, the town had scraped some kind of living from the sea. Boats docking, gulls screaming, men with weathered faces unloading crates of fish and supplies. Now the skeleton of that brief prosperity stood in the chill wind. Wooden pilings, gray and splintering, jutted out into the dark water. The pier's planks were warped and uneven, some missing entirely, leaving gaps that showed the slow, patient breathing of the tide below. Rusted metal fixtures dangled, clinking softly whenever the wind shifted. Silas paused, catching his breath. The smell of brine and old wood filled his throat. The dog's tracks veered away from the main walkway and down toward a weather-beaten storage shed crouched near the waterline. The structure leaned slightly toward the sea, as if it had grown tired of resisting. Its paint, once red, was now a tired smear of pink and gray, peeling in long curls. One shutter banged, intermittently, held by a single hinge. As he approached, a sound threaded through the whisper of waves and wind, a low, rasping noise followed by a faint metallic scrape. Silas stiffened. Every muscle in him recognized that sound. Chain against wood, an animal's labored breathing. His hand tightened on the cane until his knuckles went pale. The old training rose unbidden. Assess, approach, prepare for worst-case scenario. He pushed the door inward with his shoulder, wary of the rotten wood. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a long, pained groan. Inside, dim light seeped through gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes and the pale shapes of stored junk. Broken lobster traps, collapsed crates, a coil of rope darkened with age. The smell hit him first. Damp, old salt, and something else. Fur, fear, and neglect. In the far corner, near where the shed wall met the warped floor, lay the German shepherd. Even in the half-light he recognized the slope of her head, the pattern of black and tan on her face, the amber eyes that had glowed like coals above the river's broken mouth. Now those eyes watched him with a mix of exhaustion and wary defiance. The dog's body was angled protectively around something on the floor, her front legs slightly tense despite the tremor running through them. A thick iron chain circled her neck, links biting into matted fur. The chain extended to a heavy metal ring bolted into one of the support beams. Whoever had fastened it there had done so with the intention that she would not leave without permission or without tearing her own throat open. Her coat, seen up close, told its own story. The fur was rough, clumped with dried mud and a crust of salt along her flanks. Old scars cut white paths through the darker hair at one shoulder, an echo of past injuries that had healed without real care. Her ribs stood out starkly beneath the skin, each breath lifting them like the slats of a broken cage. Her hips jutted sharply, giving her an angular, almost fragile appearance that clashed with the strength he'd felt when she dragged him from the water. "God," Silas breathed, voice hoarse, "look what they've done to you." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Her lips lifted a fraction over her teeth. Not a full snarl, more a warning shaped by instinct rather than intent. But her eyes flicked downward as he stepped closer, and for the first time he saw what she was shielding. 3 tiny bodies pressed against her belly like drowned leaves clinging to a branch. They were puppies, German shepherd pups, though far too young to show the full majesty of the breed. Their fur was still fuzzy and uneven, a dark charcoal with hints of tan around their paws and muzzles. Their eyes were only half open, cloudy blue-gray slits that fluttered without focus. One had slid partially out from under the mother's chest, its small body shivering, paws kneading weakly at the air as if searching for warmth that kept slipping away. Another let out a faint, squeaky whine that barely reached Silas's ears over the soft lap of water outside. They were bundled in what must once have been a jacket, a human coat, now worn to threads, its fabric damp and stiff with exposure. Whoever had left them here had tried to improvise a nest, but the effort was losing its battle against the cold and the damp that seeped through the floorboards. There was a rusted metal bowl near the mother's front paws. It was empty, ringed with a crust of dried residue. Another container, a plastic bucket, held a shallow film of rainwater, cloudy with debris and a thin skin of ice forming on top. Nearby, a battered backpack slumped against the wall, one strap hanging by a strip of frayed stitching. Several empty food tins lay scattered around it, their labels peeled away by moisture. A mildewed blanket was shoved under the backpack, offering no real comfort to anything still breathing. The picture assembled itself in his mind more quickly than he wanted it to. Someone had been here, someone poor, desperate, or both. Someone who had food for the dog once, but no longer. Someone who had tied a living creature to a beam and then vanished. Heat rose in Silas's chest, spreading up into his throat until it felt like the cabin stove had been shoved there. His hands began to shake, and not from the cold. He looked at the chain digging into the dog's neck, the way her body curled to block even the faintest draft from reaching her pups. And something inside him, something that had hardened over years of Funeral flags and folded memories cracked again. "This is what they did," he whispered, darn, though there was no one to answer. "Left you here to starve and freeze, with 3 lives hanging off your ribs." He thought of other times he had arrived too late. A jungle clearing lit by flares, the smell of gasoline and blood. A medic shaking his head before Silas even reached the stretcher. The small, bitter truth that there were some things a man could not undo, no matter how far or fast he ran. Those moments had chewed on him for decades, quiet and relentless as rats. The mother dog held his gaze. Her eyes were not begging, they were not apologizing, they were full of a tired, burning determination, the same look she had worn when she had braced herself on the ice and refused to let him slip away. She gave a low sound, half warning, half plea. Her muscles quivered with exhaustion, but she did not move away from her pups, not even an inch. Silas felt his jaw tighten until it hurt. His scarred hands curled into fists at his sides, the pale marks on his knuckles stretching taut. Old pain in his fingers flared, a weather report from past injuries, but he barely registered it. "Whoever did this to you," he said quietly, his voice roughened by rage, "whoever thought they could chain you up and walk away, I know their kind. I've been fighting their kind my whole life." The dog's breath came shallow and fast. One of the puppies let out another tiny, helpless sound. The chain shifted with a faint clink as the mother tried to tuck them closer against her thin body. Silas took a slow breath, the air burning as it entered his lungs. He felt the familiar weight of regret press at the edges of his thoughts, whispering that he was old, that he was slow, that he would never be quick enough to undo all the harm this world did between heartbeats. He had lived with that voice for 40 years. It had cost him sleep, friends, and the ability to look at his own reflection for longer than a few seconds. But as he stood in that sagging shed beside the black water, looking at the dog who had dragged him back to life, and the 3 fragile sparks of existence pressed against her belly, another voice rose, hoarse, stubborn, and very much alive. "Not this time," he said. The words landed in the damp air like a promise carved into stone. "Not this time," Silas repeated, more firmly. "I was late for too many people. I'm not going to be late for you." He took one last look at the chain, the empty bowl, the jacket wrapped around the pups. Then he turned toward the open doorway, toward the path back to his cabin, and whatever tools and strength he had left. As the wind from the sea slipped in behind him, lifting the edges of the old jacket, the German shepherd's eyes followed him with a flicker of something that might have been hope. Silas stepped out into the cold, every line of his tall, aging body drawn tight with purpose. "This time," he muttered to himself, gripping his cane as if it were a rifle again, "I'm not leaving anyone behind." He knew deep in his aching chest that this was the moment that separated a survivor who could only remember, and an old man who still had the courage to save one more time. The wind off the North Hallow coast carried a restless, salt-bitten chill, the kind that licked under clothing and settled deep in the bones, but it was not a storm, just the ocean breathing harder than usual. The sky hung low and bruised, a lid of iron-gray clouds pressing the light toward the ground. Silas Marrow stood outside the sagging shed for a long moment, letting the decision settle in him with the weight of something irreversible. His tall, wiry frame ached from yesterday's fall through the ice, and his joints still throbbed with that deep, persistent pain only age and bad memories could sculpt. But none of it mattered. He had survived because the shepherd had refused to let go. Now mother and pups were trapped in a coffin of damp wood and creeping tide. That left him with only one option: bring them home. By the time he reached his cabin, his breath came ragged. Marlowe sat on the windowsill, tail stiff, his single ear erected like a censoring judge. The old cat's mottled fur bristled, as if he sensed the trouble walking toward them. Silas ignored the feline glare and hauled open the shed beside the cabin. The stale scent of old rope and spilled engine oil greeted him, along with the faint metallic rattle of his hand-me-down tools. He dragged out the wooden cargo sled he'd built years ago for hauling logs. Its runners were scarred and uneven, the rope handles frayed, but the frame was solid, good enough to carry 4 dogs across treacherous terrain. He gathered a thick wool blanket, one he remembered receiving from a military chaplain after a frostbitten patrol decades earlier. The fibers were worn soft from use, but still held heat better than anything store-bought. He snatched up an old leather coat, too heavy for him now, but perfect for bundling fragile bodies, and coiled a length of rope to secure the cargo. The satellite phone, seldom used, came last. He hesitated over it for a second, thumb tracing the grime and scratches on its surface before he pressed the power button. The line crackled before a voice answered. Elowin Price speaking. Even through static, Silas recognized the calm authority of North Hallow's only veterinarian. Dr. Elowin Price was 58, tall and thin, with silver hair always twisted into a strict bun and a face lined more by kindness than age. She had dark, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that warmed or chilled, depending on what a creature needed to survive. She was known in town for 2 things: patching up every stray within 10 miles, and never sugarcoating the truth. Elowin, it's Silas, he said, breath hitching slightly. Oh heavens, what did you do now? The question was dry, tinged with the weary amusement of someone used to tending men who acted younger than their bones. Yesterday I nearly drowned. A shepherd pulled me out. He took a breath. Today I found her chained in a collapsed shed. She's skin and bone, and she has pups. 3. A long silence. Then, describe the mother's breathing. Shallow, uneven, like every breath hurts. And the pups? Tiny, eyes barely open, cold. Another beat of silence, heavier. When she spoke again, her voice had the clipped precision of a field medic. Keep them dry, keep them warm, especially the little ones. The mother may already be in the early stages of pneumonia or dehydration. You do not have time to waste, Silas. The flooring in those sheds is damp. If the tide rises... I know, he murmured. Get them out. Bring them home. I'll talk you through everything once you're back. Silas ended the call, pocketed the phone, and fastened the sled rope around his waist. The wind stung his face as he started back toward the pier, sharp enough to make his eyes water. Even with his cane helping keep his balance, each step through the wet snow jarred his spine and hips. But the thought of those small bodies pressed against their dying mother kept him moving. The tide had risen slightly by the time he arrived, sending licks of briny water onto the warped boards of the pier. The shed door groaned when he pushed it open again. Inside, the shepherd lifted her head at the sound, ears flicking, muscles taut though trembling. Her amber eyes were clouded with fatigue but sharpened when she recognized him. The chain gave a soft metallic groan as she shifted her weight but protectively over her pups. Silas crouched slowly, ignoring the way his knees screamed in protest. Easy, girl, he murmured, letting his voice settle low and steady, the way he used to speak to frightened young soldiers on the field. He brought out the bolt cutters. The mother's lips curled faintly, just enough to show she still had fight left, but when he eased closer, she didn't bite. She watched him with wary intelligence, and something in her gaze, recognition perhaps, let him slide the cutters around the chain. One firm squeeze and the metal snapped. The shepherd startled but didn't flee. Instead, she let out a weak huff, a sound halfway between pain and relief. Silas spread the wool blanket across the sled, lifted her carefully, feeling every rib beneath his hands, and laid her on the warmth. Her head sank immediately as exhaustion overwhelmed instinct. The pups came next. Silas unbuttoned the heavy leather coat and created a nest inside it, carefully placing the 3 warm, squirming bundles inside. Their tiny paws pressed blindly against his chest as he tied the sleeves together, trapping heat inside the pouch. Their faint heartbeats thudded against him, impossibly fragile. He stepped outside with the sled rope in hand. The wind slapped him immediately, colder now that the sun refused to break the clouds. Sea mist crawled across the ground, and each gust rocked the sled behind him. He leaned forward and began the march inland. The weight wasn't much, not compared to the packs he'd carried in his 20s, but dragging it over uneven terrain tested every fiber of his aging body. Wet snow clung to the runners. The cold gnawed at his bruised ribs. His breath sounded louder than the wind, every inhale followed by a soft wheeze. But the bundle strapped to his chest gave a small whimper, and that was enough to keep him from stopping. Halfway home, he paused only long enough to adjust the coat around the pups. Marlowe would be furious at this intrusion, but Marlowe had never saved him from drowning. The shepherd had. That alone gave her the right to enter his life without permission. When he finally reached the cabin, he stumbled through the door with the last of his strength. Marlowe hunched on the table, tail puffed like a thorny bottle brush, his yellow eyes enormous with outrage. Silas could almost hear the cat's silent scream. "What is that?" "Calm down, General," Silas panted as he dragged the sled inside. "We've expanded the squad." Marlowe hissed once, offended to his core, before retreating to the top of the cupboard. Silas turned his attention to the shepherd. She lay trembling, breath rasping, but her eyes found him with quiet trust. Following Elowin's phone instructions, he placed her near the stove, wrapped her in blankets, dried her fur, cleaned the angry wounds on her neck where the chain had dug deep. He warmed goat milk, fed the pups with a tiny dropper, rubbed their bellies to help them swallow. Hours passed. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, time became a rhythm of soft whimpers, shallow breaths, and Silas's steady hands working the way they had decades ago, in field tents lit by lanterns. Each weakness in the shepherd's breathing reminded him of men he couldn't save. Each whine from the pups echoed voices he'd lost. Shadows of old failures pressed at the edges of his mind, whispering that he had always been too slow, always too late. But tonight, just tonight, he refused to listen. Silas sat beside the sleeping dogs, exhaustion settling over him like a second blanket. He rubbed a hand over his scarred knuckles, feeling the tension in them ease for the first time in years. The shepherd exhaled softly. The pups curled like warm stones against her belly. "No one dies tonight," he whispered. "Not this time." And for the first time in a long while, Silas felt the unfamiliar warmth of hope flicker in his chest. 3 days after the rescue, the cabin had taken on a new kind of noise. It was no longer just the creak of old timbers and the sullen thump of logs in the stove. Now there were tiny claws scratching inside a cardboard box near the fire, soft whimpers, and the low, rasping breaths of a German shepherd learning how to trust sleep again. Astra, Silas had started using the name in his head even before he had proof of it, breathed more evenly now. The harsh rattle that had once haunted every inhalation had softened into something shallow but steady. Her ribs still showed, but when she curled around her pups, there was a hint of strength returning in the way she held them close. The puppies had graduated from barely wriggling shadows to clumsy explorers. They crawled across the worn towels lining their box, paws splayed, noses bumping into everything, each new inch of territory conquered with the seriousness of tiny soldiers. Marlowe watched all of this from high ground, the top of the old cupboard. His one ear flat and his yellow eyes narrowed, the look of a monarch forced to tolerate squatters. Silas had begun to suspect the cat might eventually forgive him, but not soon. The knock at the door came mid-morning, a deep, slow thud that sounded like it was delivered by someone who respected the age of the wood. Silas rose from his chair, his tall, lean frame unfolding with a collection of pops and complaints from his joints. When he opened the door, the wind brought with it the smell of salt and the solid presence of Sheriff Rowan Briggs. Rowan filled the doorway without trying. He was a big man in his late 50s, broad through the chest and shoulders, like someone carved from stacked timbers. His belly had begun to soften under his uniform, but it was the slow, earned softness of a man who'd traded heavy lifting for heavier responsibility. His hair, once black, was now mostly iron gray, kept short above a weathered face lined at the corners of his mouth and eyes. A neatly kept beard shadowed his square jaw, peppered gray, giving him the look of a man who had learned to listen more than he shouted. His eyes were the part people remembered most, a clear, gentle blue that never lost their kindness, even when they narrowed in suspicion. "You look like hell, Silas," Rowan said, voice low and gravelly, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "You should see the other guy," Silas replied. "In this case, the other guy is the river." Rowan glanced past him into the cabin. His gaze landed on Astra by the stove, her black and tan head lifting from the blanket, then on the pups wobbling around their box. For a moment his lips parted, surprise softening his blunt features. "So it's true," he said quietly. "You dragged half a kennel into your house." "They dragged me out of the water first," Silas answered. "Seems fair." Rowan stepped inside, ducking his head from a trumpet, even though he cleared the frame by only an inch. He moved, with a care that didn't match his bulk, as if always aware that his size might break something delicate if he forgot himself. "We should go down to that shed of yours," he said. "See if we can figure out who tied her up there in the first place." Silas's jaw tightened. "Already have opinions about that," he muttered. "I'd prefer facts," Rowan replied gently. "Let's go get some." The abandoned pier looked different in daylight with a lawman at his side. The same gray sea gnawed at the pilings, the same warped boards creaked underfoot. But now every piece of trash, every scratch in the wood, felt like part of a story waiting to be read. Rowan moved methodically, his heavy boots testing each step, his gaze sweeping the area with practiced patience. Inside the leaning shed, the air was colder. Without Astra and her pups, the space felt emptier, the damp pressing more insistently through the boards. The imprint of their presence lingered only in flattened straw and the faint, sour, sweet smell of old fur and fear. Rowan pulled on thin gloves and searched. Silas watched him work, big hands moving gently, lifting, turning, never rushing. It reminded him uncomfortably of medics picking through wreckage. In a shadowed corner they found the first piece, a backpack crumpled against the wall, its faded canvas torn open at one seam. Inside were patched, threadbare clothes, toothbrush, cheap razor, toothpaste rolled tight. Whoever he wasn't camping, Rowan murmured. He was living out of this. A raised floorboard revealed two objects, a cracked phone and a leather collar. Silas rubbed the brass plate until the name appeared. Astra. Back at the station, Rowan charged the phone. When the screen lit, a selfie appeared. A thin young man with messy brown hair, hazel eyes, smiling into the camera. Pressed against his cheek was Astra, healthy, strong, her coat glossy and full. Inside the messages folder was one unsent draft. "My name is Corin Hale. I broke my leg. Infection. I chained my dog Astra so she wouldn't follow. She's my whole life. Please save her. I'm crawling toward the main road to get a signal." Silas read it twice. Then the guilt hit him like a rifle butt. Hours later, Rowan returned with news. A body had been found near the road. Corin Hale, just a few yards short of a place where the phone would have finally connected. That night, Astra curled around her pups by the fire. Silas knelt beside her, hand on her head. "Corin, I cursed you, thought you were a monster, but you chained her because you knew she'd follow you to death. You walked into the cold so she could live." He bowed his head. "I'll stand guard for her now, as long as I'm breathing." A few days later, they buried Corin under a lone pine overlooking the bay. Silas hung Astra's repaired collar on a wooden cross carved with Corin's name. Astra circled the grave, sniffed it, then lay down on the fresh earth, silent, steadfast, keeping vigil for the boy who died trying to save her. Spring came late to North Hallow. as if the season itself were afraid to disturb the snow. The ice on the bay didn't vanish. It retreated step by stubborn step, cracking into long gray flows before surrendering to the dark green water beneath. The wind shifted, trading its knife-edge cold for the sharp, cleaner scent of salt and thawing pine sap. In the little cabin above the bay, life was louder than the changing weather. The three shepherd pups had discovered the magical truth that gravity could be challenged and furniture could be conquered. They pinwheeled across the plank floor on oversized paws, slid into chair legs, collided with each other, then tumbled into a heap and fell asleep wherever they landed. Silas watched them from his rocking chair with the wary affection of a man who had seen squads of hot-headed recruits before. They were not soldiers, he told himself, but his heart categorized them that way anyway. He had named them the way an old soldier names the things he wishes he had clung to sooner. The largest pup, a male with a thick black saddle and a white blaze on his chest, carried himself like the world already owed him space. He charged every closed door, every unfamiliar sound, every patch of sunlight with cheerful aggression. When he barked, it came from deep in his small chest, as if he had already sworn an oath to protect something. Silas called him Valor. The middle pup, a female, was quieter. Her coat ran softer at the edges, tan bleeding gently into black along her flanks. Her eyes were warm, patient, always watching. When someone in the room sighed or shifted in a way that sounded like sadness, she came without being called, laying her head on a knee or curling her body against a foot. Silas named her Mercy. The smallest was a slip of a thing, her frame finer, her legs a little too thin for her paws. A tiny star-shaped patch of pale fur marked her chest. She tired quickly, but whenever she lifted her head, her eyes burned bright as embers, curious and stubbornly alive. That one he called Beacon. He repeated their names silently sometimes, like a prayer he was finally ready to say. The trouble was, prayers didn't fix knees, or backs, or the creeping awareness that one day he might not be able to get off the floor if all three of them piled on his lap at once. On a damp April morning, after a particularly chaotic chase that had sent a coffee mug skidding to its death, Silas stood in the middle of the cabin and let the truth land fully on him. Astra, now strong enough to move from stove to window without wobbling, watched him from her rug, head tilted. "I can't keep a whole squad," he told her, "much as I'd like to." Her amber eyes held his, steady and unflinching. "So we do what we always did," he said softly. "We assign them where they're needed most." He approached the process the only way he knew how, like a commander revising a deployment list. No ads, no free puppies scribbled on the bulletin board at the grocery store. He spoke quietly to people whose stories he already knew, weighing their scars against the pups' strange, early blooming personalities. Beacon went first. Her new person was a young nurse from the small clinic on the far side of town, Lena Ward, mid-20s, small-boned and pale, with freckles dusted across her nose like someone had started a constellation and forgotten to finish it. Her auburn hair was always escaping whatever clip she tortured it into, and the shadows under her hazel eyes told of too many night shifts and not enough sleep. She smiled easily, laughed quickly, but her gaze flicked toward doors and windows as if she was always waiting for the next emergency. Beacon toddled across Silas's floor on uncertain legs, sniffed Lena's shoes, then climbed clumsily into the woman's lap. Instead of bouncing, the little pup tucked herself into the hollow of Lena's crossed legs and let out a sigh so deep it seemed to belong to someone much older. Lena's face crumpled for a moment, something fragile and tired breaking open. "I think she chose me," she whispered. "That's how it works," Silas said. "She'll be waiting when you get off those graveyard shifts. Make sure you rest when she does." Next was Valor. He went to a family that lived halfway up the ridge, a climbing guide named Mason Dillard, sun-browned and rope-muscled with deep smile lines carved around his mouth. despite the permanent squint from too much snow glare. His dark hair was fading at the temples, and his beard was patchy, as if it never quite committed. Mason's wife, June, was quick-handed and sharp-eyed, a woman who could pack a rucksack and scold a teenager in the same breath. Their 9-year-old son, Eli, was all knees and elbows, his narrow face splattered with freckles, his hair an unruly copper mess. Eli's bedroom walls were mapped with mountain sketches and hand-drawn routes to peaks he'd never climbed. He looked at the world the way some children looked at comic books. Everything was an invitation to attempt something impossible. Valor met him in the yard. The pup barreled across the grass, tripped over a rock, crashed into Eli's shins, and immediately spun around to bark at the rock as if it had offended him. Eli burst into delighted laughter, dropped to his knees, and the two of them fell into a wrestling heap of fur and flailing limbs. "He's going to need boundaries," Silas warned. "So does Eli," Mason replied, watching his son with a fond exasperation. "We'll work it out together." Mercy left last. Her new home was a narrow, quietly kept rental near the high school. The man who opened the door when Silas knocked was in his mid-40s, tall but slightly stooped, as if he'd spent too many years leaning over desks and whiteboards. His name was Daniel Cole, and he wore his sandy hair too long at the back, like he hadn't noticed it growing past respectable. His glasses sat crooked on a nose that looked like it had been broken once, long ago. His eyes, a soft gray, held the cautious emptiness of someone recently divorced, someone who had gotten used to talking all day to classrooms full of voices and then coming home to silence that echoed. Mercy trotted inside without hesitation. She didn't jump. She didn't zoom. She simply walked up to Daniel, sat in front of him, and nudged his hand with her head. When his fingers finally lowered to touch her, she leaned her entire small body into his leg, anchoring him in place. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said, voice low. "That's all right," Silas replied. "She is." And then, like that, they were gone, folded into other lives, carrying pieces of this winter's miracle into homes that had their own quiet wars. The cabin fell still in their absence. For a few days, Silas kept expecting a clatter of paws around every corner. He found himself looking down before he stepped, listening for squeaks and yips that never came. Marlowe's absence was still a hollow. Now it echoed. Only Astra remained. The scars at her neck had healed into pale ridges beneath her thickening fur. Her coat, once dull and rough, now shone faintly where the light caught it, though a few strands of white were already threading around her muzzle. Her eyes had changed most of all. The panic that had once lurked at the edges, that flared at every loud noise, had retreated. In its place was something quieter, deeper, a watchfulness edged with grief, but anchored by acceptance. One evening, as the light thinned to that particular blue that hovers between day and night, Silas sat in his rocking chair with his feet stretched toward the stove. Astra lay at his feet, her head resting on his boot. Outside, the bay whispered against the shore. "They've all got somewhere to be now," he said, not sure whether he was talking to her or to the ghosts crowding the corners of his mind. "What about you?" Astra didn't look toward the door. She didn't glance at the road, the forest, the world beyond the windows. She shifted instead, pressing her weight more firmly against his leg, and exhaled a long, soft breath that sounded suspiciously like contentment. Silas huffed out a laugh, rough around the edges. "All right then," he murmured. "Two survivors, one old man, one stubborn dog, keeping the fire. Could be worse duty." Years slipped by, measured not in calendar pages, but in the way Astra's muzzle slowly turned to silver, and Silas's hearing slowly frayed at the edges. The town grew used to the sight of them, the tall, spare figure with the white hair and the careful, measured stride, and the German shepherd at his side, her ears a little softer, one tipping at the edge as age worked its way into her joints. When he walked, she walked beside his left knee, checking the road. When he paused, cane planted, while he caught his breath, She sat too, watching his face. When his kettle screamed on the stove and he didn't hear it, Astra would rise, walk to him, and bump his hand with her nose until he followed her back to the kitchen. When a truck rolled up the drive and his worn-out ears failed to catch the engine, she padded to the window first, tail giving a single thump that said, "Someone's here," without panic. She became, quite literally, his second set of ears. The winter she failed came softly. Snow fell, but not with teeth. The wind whispered instead of howling. Astra's hips, long stiff in the cold, grew slow. One afternoon she simply lay down on the braided rug in front of the fire and didn't bother to get up when Silas stood. When he called her name, she wagged her tail once, as if to say, "I hear you," but her body stayed where it was. He made her a nest of blankets. She eased her head into his lap as if she'd been waiting to do it that way, exactly like that, for years. He rested one weathered hand on her ribs, feeling the rise and fall of her breath. It grew shallower as night seeped in around the edges of the cabin. He did not beg. He did not shout. He had watched too many good souls cross that thin, invisible line between here and gone to pretend it could be argued with. "Go on, girl," he whispered instead, his thumb stroking the white hairs at her eyebrow. "Corin's up there on that hill, waiting under that ugly pine. Don't keep the boy waiting." Her last exhale was so soft he almost didn't feel it, just a sigh that turned into stillness. His hand stayed on her fur long after the warmth faded. He buried her beside Corin beneath the bent pine that watched the bay. One stone, one cross, one name on brass. Boy and dog, finally side by side in a way that made sense to him. The cabin afterward was not quiet, it was hollow. Every familiar sound, wind in the eaves, fire in the stove, sounded like something missing instead of something present. Without Marlowe's grumpy commentary and Astra's soft footfalls, the walls felt wider, farther apart. Silas moved through his days like a man walking through an empty barracks after the war has ended. He took his pills, he drank his coffee, he sat in his chair and watched the bay, but for the first time in a long time he could not shake the feeling that he was simply waiting for his name to be called in some final role. On a morning when the sky was pale and the snow refused to commit to either falling or melting, he made a decision. He put on his heavy coat, dug his cane into the packed path, and walked to the animal shelter at the edge of town. The building was concrete and chain link, and the sharp smell of disinfectant, but it hummed with a rough, stubborn hope. A young woman at the desk, round face, dark curls, a name tag that read Mara, looked up and smiled with the brisk kindness of someone who had learned to greet both heartbreak and joy in the same day. "Looking for a pup?" she asked. "We just got a litter of husky mixes, fluffy little troublemakers." Silas shook his head. "I don't have years to train chaos," he said wryly. "Show me the ones nobody's waiting for." The ones at the end of the row. Mara's smile softened into something more solemn. She led him down a corridor of barking voices and pleading eyes. At the very last kennel, the barking faded. The dog lying there was medium-sized, neither sleek nor impressive. His coat was a muddle of gray and brown, like someone had painted him with leftover colors and never bothered to blend. One ear stood up crookedly, the other flopped over his temple like it had given up halfway through the job. His muzzle was grayed, his eyes cloudy at the edges. But when Silas stopped at the gate, those eyes sharpened with a cautious, hopeful light. He did not rush the door. He did not leap or bark. He just lifted his head and wagged his tail once, a small, tentative tap against the plastic cot. More question than celebration. "Rust here is about 10, Mara said softly. "Owner surrendered. Arthritis, a little slow, not exactly what most folks come looking for." Silas lowered himself until his knees protested, bringing his lined face level with the bars. He slid his fingers through the mesh. The dog leaned forward, sniffed, then gave his hand a single gentle lick. It was not Astra's lick. It was not any dog's but his own. That was the point. "Yeah," Silas murmured. "You know the drill. So do I. He looked up at Mara. I'll take him. Paperwork took time, but not enough to change his mind. When they were done, Silas opened the truck's passenger door and, with a grunt of effort, lifted the old dog onto the seat. Rust, if that was the name that stuck, settled in immediately, his body heavy but relaxed, eyes half closed as if he'd already decided the ride would end somewhere warmer than concrete floors and echoing barks. On the drive back toward the bay, the winter light spilled across the road in thin silver sheets. Far off, the hill with the pine trees stood like a dark stitch against the sky. Silas rested his hand on the dog's rough fur. The animal leaned into the touch, let out a long, contented sigh. "We're not replacing anyone," Silas said quietly, more to the ghosts than to the dog. "We're just carrying the fire they left us. That's what survivors do." The truck rolled on toward the little cabin over the water, toward one more shared winter, one more chance to keep the dark from feeling quite so empty. In the quiet corners of North Hallow, where the ocean wind carries both sorrow and hope, Silas, Astra, Corin, and even the old dog Rust remind us of something powerful, something ancient and sacred, that miracles do not always descend from the sky. Sometimes they arrive on four trembling paws, sometimes through a hand reaching out when we least expect it, and sometimes they arrive as the simple courage to keep living one more day. Every act of kindness, saving a life, opening a door, choosing love over fear, is a small spark of God's light moving through this world. Even in the coldest winters of our lives, He never leaves us without warmth. He sends it through the loyalty of a dog, the compassion of a stranger, or the quiet voice in our heart that whispers, "Keep going, I am here." Silas thought he was alone. Astra thought she was abandoned. Corin thought he would die unseen. But God wove their broken paths together, and from their pain rose a legacy that outlived them all. And that is the truth for each of us. Your story isn't over. Your hurt isn't wasted. Your kindness today might be the miracle someone has been praying for. So as you step back into your own life, into your own struggles, joys, fears, and hopes, remember, you carry the same light. You can be someone's miracle, and God's grace follows you wherever you go.